first speaker. Mr. Jonathan Adkins is the CEO for the Governor's Highway Safety Association, a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. that represents state and territorial highway safety offices across the nation. He is responsible for directing the organization's Washington headquarters office, serving as the association's chief liaison with NHTSA and other federal agencies, and representing the organization on Capitol Hill and with private sector partners. Outside of work, Jonathan spends his time volunteering time with Dickinson College, West Virginia University, and the Matthew Shepard Foundation, among others. He and his husband reside in Washington, D.C. It is my honor to introduce my friend, Jonathan Adkins.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you everyone in the audience today and everyone who's online who is joining us. This is a great honor. As I look at the panel here, I know the two folks on the end, Michelle, as she said, and I have known each other pretty much our whole career, and I appreciate her leadership and for doing this on her birthday today, which she deserves extra credit. I did not know our esteemed panelists in the middle before today, and I'm really excited to hear from them. And I've known Angie for a long time, mostly online. You're going to hear about her fantastic book. I read it during COVID and I learned a lot, and I'll be honest with you, it changed my thinking a little bit about how we address vulnerable road users and pedestrian safety. So wait, there's more good things to come in this session. It's going to be fantastic. Safety is personal, right? It impacts us all. This issue of vulnerable road users is no different. I'm a walker, I'm a pedestrian. My goal every day is to get about 17,000 steps per day. I'm doing really well today because I'm on East Coast time. I got up early. It was a little bit dark for me at 5 a.m. this morning, so I got my 11,000 steps on the treadmill. And I've got to tell you, incidentally, I finally got to listen to the new Beyonce album, Country Carter. I mean, the girl has brought it. So if you're looking for a new album when you're out biking and rolling, highly recommend the new Beyonce album. I said safety is personal, and so most days I'm getting my 10,000 steps in the morning outside in Washington, D.C. I also have the privilege of walking to work. It's about 1.25 miles each way. So these issues, while we talk about data and numbers, they're personal to all of us, and that's a little bit about my safety story. I do want to go ahead and dig into some of the numbers here. How many of you are familiar with GHSA, the Governor's Highway Safety Association? Almost all of you. That's fantastic. We do represent the state and highway safety offices across the country. Colorado DOT, I'm proud to say, is our member. They have been a fantastic host of this conference. I've been to more Lifesavers conferences than I'm going to admit, but this is definitely one of the best of them. And GHSA is proud of all of our members, but particularly our great host here in Colorado. If you're not familiar, about half the highway safety offices are like Colorado. They're in state DOTs. Several are in state DMVs, and then another big chunk are in state departments of transportation, or state departments of safety, rather. And then we have a few other independent agencies across the country. GHSA, for about 10 years, has been looking annually at pedestrian fatalities. We are really the first look. We do a preview of what's happened in the year before. We've done that for about 10 years in a row. Our numbers typically differ just a little bit from NHTSA and from the National Safety Council, but it's not a big difference, and it gives us a really good overlook of where things stand. It is the first look at national trends. We issue 2 reports every year. We do one early in the year from the previous year's January through June data, and then we do a full report a little bit later in the year full of recommendations. The reports generate a ton of media interest, and that's nice. Everybody likes media clips, but why do we really like media clips? We like media clips because that's how we influence change, right? So we are able to help lead the national discussion on pedestrian safety with our partners at NHTSA and many of you in the room and online. We talk a lot about numbers, and I'm going to do that today. You hear that this number's up, this number's down. How many of you have been directly impacted by a traffic crash? Keep your hands up. How many of you have been impacted by a pedestrian safety crash? Again, many, many people in the room. And so while I talk about numbers, it's really important that, particularly those of us who do this for a living, that we don't just focus on the numbers. We talk about lives. We talk about moms and dads that are no longer at the table. We talk about losing our children, losing our friends. We talk about near misses. As a pedestrian, again, as somebody who walks a lot every day, I have more near misses than I will care to admit. Living in Washington, D.C., I now have Rick Byrd, who's the head of the D.C. Highway Safety Office, so he's getting those messages like, this area is dangerous, we need more enforcement, we need better infrastructure. Again, as I said, safety is personal, and we can never forget that. So what do the GHSA numbers show? So as we look at 2023, again, the first 6 months, finally some good data. Michelle teed up that, as most of us know, the data and the trends have not been good, but we're excited finally to see some good news for 2023. We looked at those first 6 months, and we projected that drivers struck and killed 3,373 people. That's 3,373 families that don't have someone at their table, that they are going through the most unimaginable loss. Pedestrian fatalities are down 4% for those first 6 months of 2023 compared to 2022. That is a modest reduction, but it is encouraging after many years of sharp increases. But we are well above 2019. So if you look at 2019 where we were and you look at where we are in 2023, that picture is not as rosy. We know what happened during the pandemic. Pedestrians, other vulnerable road users were dying in a lot greater numbers. And so we're excited to see some positive news, but we have a lot of work to do. And on that note, look at what's happened over the last decade. We look for trends in highway safety, and sometimes we say numbers are going up, numbers are going down. This is really clear. I mean, it's dramatic, up 58% since 2013. That's pretty crazy, right? And alarming. Our good friends at NHTSA, just right before this conference, came out with the final 2022 fatality numbers. And I want to give a shout out to the folks at the state and the local level and at NHTSA. We're doing a better job at getting these numbers out, right, and getting these reports out. It's really critical that we have timely data. How do we develop good programs in highway safety? We have to have good data. And so we've got to get those reports out. We've got to get the data faster. And we're making some progress. More to come, but we are making some progress. So again, if we look at 2022, the GHSA numbers were just from the first half of 2023. So the last year that we have a full set of data is 2022. And we saw, unfortunately, that the pedestrian deaths were at a 40-year high. We hope that is the end of that trend and that we're going to start having multiple years now. 2023 is looking good, as I said, and starting to head down. That's really, really critical. I want to give you a stat that my team shared and I think is really incredible. Drivers killed more people walking in one day in 2022, that's about 20 per day, than commercial plane crashes killed in more than a decade. So I'm going to say it again. Drivers killed more people walking in one day in 2022 than commercial plane crashes killed in a decade. Now that's not to minimize the importance of commercial air safety. I got on a plane the other day. My mom literally texted me. I said, I'm on my flight. She said, I hope you're not on a Boeing plane. Fine, Mom, I was not on a Boeing plane. I even got here a little bit early. But that tells you about our culture, right? We're obsessed with air safety, and we should be. But we don't have that same level of obsession with roadway safety and pedestrian safety. So I wanted to highlight that a little bit. So again, going back to the GHSA data from 2023, the orange is good, the blue is bad. So if your state is up here in orange, that means for those first 6 months of 2023, your numbers are going down. More lives were being saved than 2022. You're making some progress. The blue states on the list, you have some work to do, right? We want this whole map to be orange. If I'm privileged to be here next year, I want to come in and I want to have a full map of orange, right? When we look at pedestrian data and data in general in roadway safety, we're looking at a lot of different data points, right? We have the FARS data, we have telematics data, we have state data, we have data from the National Safety Council. We also have the fatality rate data. And I will tell you, that is my least favorite data point. The last thing I ever want to tell someone is, I'm sorry that you lost your child, but our rate is down. That's not a good story. I want to look at overall number of families impacted. But rate does certainly have its place. Our pedestrian fatality rate for 2023, as GHSA looked at, is going down. Again, it's a little bit of a bump down from where we were in 2022. The states that are in blue have some work to do. They're seeing their rate going up. And you notice they're generally all together, right? They're in generally these warmer states, these autocentric states. And so there's something that needs to be looked at as we think about cultural, making sure that we have the right infrastructure, right? I'm going to pick on Florida because Florida is a state that I like to spend a lot of time in. What's happened in Florida the last few years as we think about COVID? A lot of people have moved to Florida. People have escaped the cold weather in the Northeast. We don't have research on this yet, but I think a lot of people moved to states in blue because of COVID policies, right? They wanted to go to a wedding. I was invited to 3 weddings during COVID. They were all in Florida because the brides knew that they wouldn't be canceled, right? And so I think as we go on in time, we're going to need to look at a lot of these populations trends, these cultural trends, to see why people are moving to some of these states and why is it not safer for them to walk. Whether you're in Florida or whether you're in West Virginia, you should be able to walk where you're going and not be worried about a traffic crash, right? So what's driving this increase in fatalities? Whether we look at 2022 or those first six months of 2023, deaths are way too high. 0 is the only acceptable number, right? We know part of that is because of traffic enforcement. There has been a steep decline in traffic enforcement across the country since 2020. That has made a huge impact. Study after study from NHTSA, from Cambridge Mobile Telematics, from others show us that when we have fair and equitable traffic enforcement on the roads, people know about it, traffic deaths and injuries go down. And so we have seen just the opposite over the last few years. Now, enforcement is not a panacea, right? We cannot enforce our way out of this problem. We have to look at the infrastructure. We have to look at vehicle size. Vehicles are getting bigger. We're making progress in our infrastructure, but we're not making it as quickly as we would like, right? And there's a lot of debate about these factors, like what has been causing that. We could probably have just a whole session on that. But I always remind people that if you look at today and you look at 2020, vehicles are largely the same. They have gotten bigger, but they've also gotten safer. There's more safety benefits to a newer car, right? Our roadways are improving. Our roadways haven't suddenly gotten worse. So what's changed since 2020? It's been the lack of enforcement and driver behavior, right? We are driving more aggressively. We are speeding, and a lot of us think we can get away with it. Guess what? In a lot of cases, we can. But all hope is not lost, right? We know about the safe system approach. You've heard about it throughout this conference already. I think that my takeaway from the safe system approach as it relates to pedestrian safety is it's not either or. Think about the multiple choice box. You can check all the boxes. We can't just focus on infrastructure. We can't just focus on vehicle technology. We can't just focus on enforcement. We have to do all these different things. We have to build this layer in. Think about a safety improvement program. Think about a roadway. We all know of one. I could think of a couple. I don't know if Rick Burt's in the room, but I'm going to send you these as I walk to work in Washington, D.C. We need to have the speed slowed down, so the lanes need to be narrowed. And they're on the list to have just that done in Washington, D.C. But while that construction is starting to be thought about, and even while the project is underway, we need to have more community engagement. We need to let folks know that that's a dangerous area, that there's going to be construction. We need to have more enforcement in that area, right? Because there's construction underway. There's a history of fatalities. But as that safety infrastructure is improved, we can do less, hopefully, of enforcement. We won't have to talk to the community as much because the roadway won't be as dangerous. So we can't just pick and choose. We can't just say, I'm only going to focus on vehicle safety, or I'm only going to focus on infrastructure. We have to do all these different things. And that's really the hope and the promise of the safe system. If I were here 5 or 6 years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We would be saying, oh, we've got to really focus on behavior. We've got to do the infrastructure. We finally in this country have shifted and understood that we have to do all these different things. We can't just pick and choose. I am honored to be here today. I'm happy to have shared some of the GHSA data, and as I said, we've got some great panelists, and look forward to learning from you all and getting your ideas.
Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate that. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, my colleague, Karen Scurry from the Federal Highway Administration. Karen is a program manager with the Federal Highway Administration in the Highway Safety Improvement Program. And Karen, we're happy to have you here today.
Thank you, Michelle, and then thank you all of you for coming today and inviting me to talk about vulnerable road user safety assessments. As Michelle noted, I'm with the Federal Highway Administration, and we work with state and local governments to design, construct, and maintain our nation's roads through delivery of the Federal Aid Highway Program. Oh, there we go. So one of the programs in that Federal Aid Highway Program that I manage is the Highway Safety Improvement Program, or HSIP, as we commonly refer to it. And the purpose of the HSIP is to reduce fatalities and serious injuries on all public roads, and that includes non-state-owned roads and roads on tribal lands. And the HSIP is a core federal aid highway program, and what that means is that it's federally funded but state administered. So Federal Highway Administration sets the requirements for the program based on the legislation, and then states implement the program to best meet their needs and capabilities. And so I'm sure, as you can imagine, that results in 52 completely different HSIPs across the nation, but what they all have in common is that each state has a strategic highway safety plan. And that plan lays out a framework to reduce fatalities and serious injuries in the state through multidisciplinary strategies. And it is developed in consultation with a wide variety of stakeholders, and I'm hopeful that some of you are involved in your state's strategic highway safety plan efforts. The HSIP also includes a data-driven roadway safety management process that helps states identify and prioritize locations for highway safety improvement projects. And under the bipartisan infrastructure law, states receive just over $3 billion each year to implement those highway safety improvement projects. And that's about a 34% increase in HSIP funding as compared to the funding we had available under the FAST Act, but still only about 6% of the total federal aid highway program. In addition to increased funding, the bipartisan infrastructure law also brought us a new or renewed emphasis on vulnerable road users. There were two new requirements established under the Highway Safety Improvement Program related to vulnerable road users. The first was a vulnerable road user safety special rule, which requires states that have 15% or more vulnerable road user fatalities to spend at least 15% of their HSIP funds on highway safety improvement projects to address vulnerable road user safety. And then the second requirement is for states to develop a vulnerable road user safety assessment as part of their strategic highway safety plan. And so that's what I'm going to talk about here today. I did just want to set the stage a little bit so you could see how this fits into the broader safety program at Federal Highway and with the state DOTs. So as part of the vulnerable road user safety assessment, states are required to use a data-driven process to identify areas of a high risk to vulnerable road users. And once they've identified those areas of high risk, they're required to consult with local governments in those areas. And then, based on that consultation, develop a program of highway safety improvement projects to improve safety of vulnerable road users in those high-risk areas. And so I'm going to talk through each of these requirements in a little bit more detail and also share with you some preliminary findings from a high-level review that Federal Highway has done, just to give you a feel for what's included in those state vulnerable road user safety assessments. So the foundation of the HSIP, and I'm sure much of the work that all of you do, I mean, I've heard data talked about in almost every session since the start of this conference, is that data-driven process, and that carries through in the vulnerable road user safety assessment. And so states performed a quantitative analysis of vulnerable road user fatalities and serious injuries using a wide variety of data, and I'll give you a quick snapshot of what types of data they were using in just a few seconds. But they were also required to consider demographics of the locations of those vulnerable road user fatalities and serious injuries, which was a new requirement for HSIP. But because of this requirement, we're starting to see that spread into states' other HSIP activities as well. And then based on that data, states identified areas as high risk to vulnerable road users. And so let's just take a quick look at what some of that data looked like. And so this is just a snapshot of the data sources that states used in their vulnerable road user safety assessment. And unsurprisingly, most states use their own state crash databases, but some also supplemented that data analysis with information available in FARS, traffic and roadway data, as well as census data. But what I like most about this is that some states were able to bring in public health data, EMS data, and police citation data. And I'd love to see more of that as we move forward and states update their vulnerable road user safety assessments, and I suspect many of you can help with that. So when I get to the end and that call to action, I think this is an opportunity for folks to work together and collaborate to improve vulnerable road user safety. Safety data, so this shows what types of data states use in their vulnerable road user safety assessment. At the top of the list are location, and I wonder if I can get this to work. Location, roadway functional classification, time of day, speed limit, and volume data. So those are the traditional data sources that we see used in highway safety analysis. But what I was really surprised about and love to see is that some states are starting, oh geez, me and technology. Some states are starting to incorporate, back one more. Travel patterns, pedestrian and bicycle counts, as well as near miss events. And so I know a lot of states have challenged getting access to this kind of data, and so I was excited and surprised to see that some states are already starting to move in this direction, and I think we'll start to see more of this as more of this data becomes available to states. Looking at demographic data, I think we've heard about overrepresentation regarding demographics. So most states looked at, oh, here I go again. Race, ethnicity, income, and age. But some states were also able to look at gender, disability status, vehicle ownership, home ownership, and then there were a handful of states that were able to work with their partners to get houselessness data and incorporate that into their analysis, which led to some very revealing findings. And then if we look at the high-risk areas, so all of that data came together to identify high-risk areas, and the states had a great deal of flexibility in how they identified high-risk areas, as you can see here. So a majority of states identified specific locations, so intersections or segments that are of high risk to vulnerable road users. Some states also looked at high-risk geographic areas, so maybe a city or a municipality or a county or maybe even a MPO region. Other states use systemic safety analysis, so if you were in the data session during the first workshop today, you heard Rob talk about systemic safety analysis, and so states use that analysis to identify specific facility types that are greater risk for vulnerable road user crashes. So major arterials in suburban areas are one that we talk about frequently at Federal Highway as a high risk to vulnerable road users. So Mohammad is actually, he follows me today, and he's going to talk in much more detail about the data and the methodology that Connecticut DOT used in their vulnerable road user safety assessment. I just wanted to give you that high-level picture of the types of data and analysis states are using in their vulnerable road user safety assessments, but I'm excited to hear more from Mohammad. So after the states identified those high-risk areas, they were required to consult with local governments that represent those high-risk areas. And so in our guidance, Federal Highway also encouraged the states to engage with tribal governments, especially if those high-risk areas were located on tribal land. We also encouraged states to consult with institutional advocacy and community groups. And the reason for that is that those folks have firsthand knowledge of the safety issues that are occurring in their communities, as well as solutions that are best fit for their community. It occurred to me as I was sitting in that data session earlier that local agencies also have access to data that state DOT folks might not have access to. And so by consulting and collaborating and engaging with those local communities, a wide array of solutions and data and insights into what's going on in those communities to make them at higher risk for vulnerable road users is available. And so consultation, I think, was a key part of these vulnerable road user safety assessments. And if there's one thing that I heard from the state DOTs is that they didn't have enough time to do as much of that as they would have liked. And so I think moving forward, that we'll see more engagement with local communities as states are updating their vulnerable road user safety assessments. And so this is just a quick picture of who the state DOTs consulted with as they developed their vulnerable road user safety assessments. Of course, we have the local governments, but states also consulted, more than half of the states consulted with those advocacy or community groups, tribal governments, transit agencies, and as well as emergency response agencies. So as the outcome of that data analysis and consultation, states developed a program of program of projects or strategies to improve vulnerable road user safety. And as part of that, they were required to consider the safe system approach, so a lot of what we've been talking about at this conference. And so just to give you a quick peek at the types of projects and strategies that were included in these vulnerable road user safety assessments, you can see that this covers all aspects of that safe system approach that we've been talking about. Especially there were strategies to improve data and analysis capabilities so that we can get more travel pattern data, more traffic counts for vulnerable road users. Policy type strategies, so developing complete streets policies and those kinds of things. I did pull out a couple of example behavioral strategies that I thought all of you might be most interested in. And interestingly enough, I'm sure I can point to the program for this conference and find a workshop on each one of these types of strategies. So some of these are probably very familiar to you. There were strategies to improve education of existing laws for vulnerable road users, both for the public as well as for law enforcement. There were strategies to provide safety education for those that are responsible for designing, operating, maintaining, and using the roadways. On Sunday morning, I attended a session on safety culture, which was fabulous, and there were strategies in several of the vulnerable road user safety assessments to really create a culture of roadway safety. And I think that what North Carolina is doing is a great example of how states can move forward in this direction. There were strategies to conduct high visibility enforcement, both for cell phone use as well as distracted driving, and I know we've heard a lot about that in this conference. And then on the other side of the education is for school students, both elementary students to encourage biking and walking to school, as well as for licensing, so incorporating safety for vulnerable road users into driver licensing testing. So all states have completed their vulnerable road user safety assessments and included them as part of their strategic highway safety plans. And those plans are available on each state's website, and we've linked each of them on our SHSP website, which the link is here, and you should have access to all of these slides through the app. Federal highways, so we did a preliminary review, which I shared some of that data just with you just now. We are currently doing a more deep dive review, and as part of that, we hope to identify some noteworthy practices that we can share more broadly, as well as some lessons learned, where there might be a need for more guidance or technical resources to support states' efforts, because they will be updating their vulnerable road user safety assessments every time they update their SHSP, which is at least once every 5 years. So now that all states have completed their vulnerable road user safety assessments, the focus is now on implementation. And one thing that we can all do to support implementation and improve vulnerable road user safety is to prioritize vulnerable road user safety investments in all projects and programs throughout the project development process. So that's from planning and programming to design and construction to operations and maintenance. And the vulnerable road user safety assessment can inform all of those activities. And I know when we talk about implementation, we always talk about funding. Funding always comes up. I talked about the HSIP and the Vulnerable Road User Safety Special Rule funding that's available, but really most of the Federal Aid Highway Program funding can be used to improve safety for vulnerable road users. There are also several discretionary grant programs that are out there that can be used for vulnerable road user safety projects. And if you've not seen it, Federal Highway has a matrix that outlines all of these available federal funding sources, as well as the different types of vulnerable road user projects, and shows you which projects are eligible under which funding categories. So this is a great resource, especially if you have vulnerable road user safety projects that you want to advance. I would highly encourage you to take a look at this, this matrix. And then as I want to wrap up with a call to action for all of you, I think I gave you a little heads up that this was coming. But I think in our plenary yesterday, the Colonel said something that really struck me, that if we're going to reach our goal of 0 fatalities, we can't do it alone. We have to work together, we have to support each other, and I think that we can all work together on vulnerable road user safety. This is something that impacts all of us. We all walk every day, and this is an area that we can all come together and get to 0 fatalities in vulnerable road user safety. So the first thing you can do is review your state's vulnerable road user safety assessment. see what's in there. The states did a great job at analyzing the data, and so I think you will maybe gain some insights from that analysis as well. There are a ton of strategies, possibly projects in there that you might be able to integrate into your projects and strategies, your plans and programs. Some of you might even be in a position to implement some of those projects and strategies. There is a notice of funding opportunity out there now for Safe Streets and Roads for All. And so if one of those high-risk areas is in your community, you could apply for an SS4A demonstration grant or an implementation grant to implement a project to improve vulnerable road user safety in that high-risk area. But most importantly, I think we can collaborate, we can engage with our partners. I'm an engineer. You can learn a lot from law enforcement. I think law enforcement can teach the engineers a lot. There's an opportunity to coordinate with emergency response personnel to see how we can better accommodate them on our roads. So I would just encourage all of you to collaborate with partners, get outside of your silo, and engage in the broader safety community so that we can reach our goal of 0 deaths. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Michelle.
Thank you, Karen. Our next speaker is Dr. Shaon. Dr. Shaon is an associate research scientist at the Connecticut Transportation Institute. Before joining CTI, he worked as a senior research specialist in the Department of Civil and Architectural Engineering and Mechanics at the University of Arizona. Dr. Shaon received his PhD degree from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee with a focus in transportation engineering. Dr. Shaon has been working as the principal investigator and co-PI on several federal and state-funded research projects, intelligent transportation system, crash data analytics, vulnerable road user safety, and traffic operations. Dr. Shaon's research work examines the fundamental nature of road user behavior. Dr. Shaon's research work gained significant research interest and media attention to increase awareness among road users for safety issues. Dr. Shaon.
Thank you, Michelle, for the introduction. I think my presentation fits perfectly right after Karen's presentation, so you can look at this presentation as a case study, what we did for Connecticut. So before I start, how many of you are involved with vulnerable road user safety assessment in your jurisdiction? Okay. So a lot. Okay, so you will see when we talk about safety assessment, as Karen presented, it's mostly analytical analysis of the data, but maybe I won't bore you with complicated statistical methodology you will see. So we are really proud of this study. So we will see how a simple data exploration can be used to analyze different type of crashes. So as Karen mentioned, in the bipartisan infrastructure law, each state needs to develop a vulnerable road user safety assessment as part of their HSIP, Highway Safety Improvement Plan. The schedule was each state need to finish their initial assessment by November 15th, and for methodology, it was recommended to use a data-driven analytic procedure to analyze vulnerable road user fatality and serious injuries to identify areas of high-risk crashes. Under the safe system approach, so as we mentioned, so each states are also recommended, they need to also incorporate equity-related factor along with the crash, roadway, and traffic variable that we usually use. So these are the recommendations from Federal Highway. So when we started analyzing the data from Connecticut, so we started with looking at existing methodology. What are the methodology we have in the literature? So first one is the Milestone Highway Safety Manual. Highway Safety Manual uses safety performance functions to predict crashes, which are used to identify high-risk crash locations. But if you look at the functional qualitative relationship between ADT and crashes, more ADT means more crash. So more of the high-risk location will be identified at high ADT location compared to low ADT location. So the safety improvement programs will also be identified in the crash condensed urbanized areas compared to rural areas. Another critical thing about SPF is a function between crash and ADT. But when we are talking about vulnerable road users crashes, pedestrian and bike crashes, we need pedestrian volume, bike volume. Most of the states are still looking for this data, and we don't have this data in Connecticut. So the alternative from this highway safety manner method is what we see in literature is an aggregated crash prediction model, which analyzes crashes as a census tract, block group, or traffic analysis zone, where we use socio-demographic characteristics and use the combined total number of crashes within those each area level unit, like block group or census tract or TAZ. So based on these two methodologies, so now the question is, how do we develop a comprehensive vulnerable road user safety assessment methodology, where we can consider the site level factor, which is lane width, number of turn lanes, intersection characteristics, how we also overcome the limitation of identifying sites at more crash condensed urbanized areas compared to rural areas. We also need to incorporate equality-related factors. And then, how do we combine risks from these two sources, one from site level and one from area level? So these are our research questions when we started this research. So what we wanted to do is, we do have a site level analysis which uses roadway characteristics or intersection characteristics. We also have an area level analysis which uses social equity or socio-demographic characteristics. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to combine these two and create a comprehensive risk assessment methodology which can combine risks from both of these sources. Okay, so the methodology we used is under the safe system domain, which is called systemic safety approach. Systemic safety is nothing new. It's actually proposed in 2013. So Federal Highway actually published this study in 2013, which focused on, rather than identifying high-risk crash sites with high crashes, it identifies high-risk roadway features, like which lane width are more associated with more fatal and severe injury crashes. It also helps agencies to broaden their traffic safety efforts with little extra cost. And it does not replace, so one thing to notice is it does not replace the highway safety manual method, it supplements it. So it's a supplemental methodology if you cannot implement highway safety manual method or if you want to broaden your safety efforts. So the steps are very simple. You identify a crash type. So for our case, it's a vulnerable road user crashes. Then we identify the facility type where we want to implement. Then identify risk sources. What are the risk sources we want to use in our analysis? And then conduct risk assessment. We assign risk scores for each of these factors, and then prioritize focus facility elements. Let's talk about the data set. So as we mentioned, so we wanted to combine site level and area level. So we do have two different data sources. One is that area level data, which you can collect from. So it's very interesting is area level data, socio-economic and demographic or equity-related data are now available to everyone. So for example, US Census publishes American Community Survey. There is a data set from EPA that's called Smart Location Database. They uses this US Census data and calculates some performance measures out of this data, which also can be used. So we did this analysis in two levels. One is area level. We did the analysis for the area level at a block group, which is the smallest unit we can find as a spatial unit. And for the site level, we analyze the data at segment and intersection. Once both of these data are analyzed, then we used a simple methodology, is combined risk scores by weight. So we normalize these two scores. So now each of the score is a range between 0 to 100, and then we use a weight. So 50% weight from, for example, 50% weight from air level and 50% weight from site level, and then we combine these two to create a comprehensive risk score for each of the site. So an example of equity-related factors, so we actually started with more than 100 variables when we started incorporating equity-related factors, but later on we trimmed it out and we selected these variables. So for demographic, we use population, gender, age, race, ethnicity. For socioeconomic characteristics, education level, income, percent in labor force, poverty. We also use some business data, job density, national walkability index, network density, and we also use the land use data to identify where are the low intensity development and high intensity development. So just a little bit about the methodology, as I mentioned. So we didn't use any statistical method. So we used a crash overrepresentation. So the way one of the key element of systemic safety is you need to categorize each of your risk factors. So for example, if you have divided your risk factors, let's say lane width less than 12 feet, 12 and 13 feet, and anything more than 13 feet. So you create 3 categories. So here I'm providing an example for 5 categories. So what are the K crashes severe injury and fatal crashes, and what is the VMT proportion. The difference between these two are usually called crash overrepresentation. But if you look at the crash overrepresentation, you will get higher crash overrepresentation where there is higher ADT or higher crash. You won't get higher overrepresentation if there is a very low number of ADT or VMT or crash is present. So what we did, we used a simple tricks, we normalized them. So now each of these levels are compared at 100% VMT level. Now you can see when there was 0.91% VMT, it was 0.16 overrepresentation, now it's 17%. And 2.67, 1.26% VMT become 111% normalized overrepresentation. So what it is doing, it is emphasizing sites with low ADT and providing more risk to those sites. Now, there's still one question remains is how we accommodate the non-linear relationship between crash counts and ADT or VMT. So what we did, we divided all sites into 3 quantile levels using their percentile value and calculated risk scores using these for each of these quantile. So in simple, we calculated normalized overrepresentation, then we assign a risk score from 0 to 10 for each of these normalized overrepresentation. Then we normalize the score for visualization purpose and then calculated the total risk scores. So this is one of the example for the block group level variable. So you have 5 levels for each of this variable, and you can see the normalized score on the right and actual score on the left. This is for site level, same thing. So we created categories and then we presented each of them. So as we didn't use any statistical methodology, how do we compare results once we get the result? So what we did is we created groups out of these risk scores, so 10 groups, and then we checked what is the crash rate of these results. So as you can see, so group 1 is the highest risk and group 1 is the lowest risk and group 10 is the highest risk. So the first one is total entering volume for an intersection. As you can see that it has the lowest VMT but the highest crash. And the overrepresentation, and the last one is actually crash rate, which is the highest. So which means after implementing this methodology, so the results you are getting, it is identifying sites that has a high crash rate in the top high-risk group. So now that we develop this methodology, yes, it's identifying sites that has a high crash risk. But let's say you are a practitioner, so you want to implement this methodology, but you don't want to go into more details and calculate the scores on your own. So what we did is we developed a tool for Connecticut DOT, which includes 3 modules similar to Highway Safety Manual. First one is crash hotspot identification, then diagnosing those crash, and then the last module is crash countermeasure database. So this is a user interface of a tool. You can select vulnerable road user crash, which is the combination of pedestrian and bike crash, or you can also analyze them separately. You select the start and end year and select your unit, whether you want to do it at block group level or a site level, whether it's an intersection or segment, and then you analyze this. This is the result. So there's an area level score, site level score, and total score and their ranking. So as I mentioned, the area level and site scores are combined using just a weight, 50% for each of them. So, and we allowed users to change them if they want to change these weights. This is a map view of our network screening results. So it's an interactive map. So you can click on this map and see the results for each of this site. Once this network screening is done, you may want to explore the trend in the crashes. So here comes our diagnosis module. So diagnosis modules allows users to see the trend or pattern in crashes. So crash by which month of the year, or which day of the week, or which time of the day has high pedestrian and bike crashes compared to all crashes. Then we also checked by severity, so whether there is any severity are more prominent in VRU crashes compared to all other crashes. Same thing for age group, which age group are getting more involved in VRU crashes. Then we compared by gender or for all drivers and scenario driver. Scenario driver is our VRU crash scenario that we are talking about. We also explored the overlap between different emphasis area crashes. So for example, as you can see, that for pedestrian and bike crashes, there is a significant overlap for aggressive driving related crashes. 21% of the pedestrian and bike crash also involve aggressive driving behavior. So that also helps practitioners to understand what type of crashes, what type of behavior is more contributing to this type of crashes. So some more diagnosis plots. At the end is the countermeasure module. So this is another contribution of our study is we conducted an extensive literature review. We identified pedestrian and bike-related countermeasures from different sources, from NCHRP 500 series, NCHRP 622, countermeasures that work, and we compiled this countermeasure database and implemented with this tool. So users can click on this one and see the detail of each countermeasure and select it for safety project development. So some takeaways. So we developed a data-driven framework for VRU safety assessment. We proposed a systemic approach to combine risk scores from site and area level. Using this methodology, we developed a tool which are currently now being used by the Connecticut DOT, and we also developed a dedicated VRU countermeasures that has been incorporated within this tool. I think that's pretty much everything. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me or any of my team members. We'll be happy to help you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shaon. Our last speaker today is Ms. Angie Schmitt. Angie is the founder of 3MPH Planning and Consulting, a Cleveland-based planning firm focused on communications, advocacy, and traffic safety planning. She is the author of Right Away, Race, Class, and a Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America, which was published in 2020 by Island Press, and I think all of my staff have read her book. So Angie, without further ado.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that introduction. So a couple of years ago, I wrote this book, and at the time, I finished my book right before the pandemic. I finished up in February of 2020. And, the whole book is written talking about the pedestrian safety crisis in the U.S. So at the time, actually, everything started shutting down, and I really worried, from a selfish perspective, how relevant is this discussion even going to be anymore? Usually when we have an event like a pandemic or a recession that causes people to drive less, we see pedestrian fatalities decline. Instead, what we saw was the exact opposite. So I've actually been traveling around speaking about this problem, the pedestrian safety crisis, I call it, for about 5 years. And over that time, we've seen these deaths rise about 20%. So a really, really bad outcome, and actually not what I would have predicted. I wrote a little forward to my book, in these crazy early days of the pandemic, sort of predicting that traffic deaths and pedestrian deaths would fall. And of course, we've seen the exact opposite. So usually when I do these presentations, I'm sort of the bad news person, but Jonathan kind of took care of that. And I'm going to talk about actually some reasons for optimism, because I have, just since the book was published, and again, it was only in 2020, I've had to revise my presentation a couple times. A lot of interesting stuff has happened, in part due to the fact that so many people are suffering and dying this way. Okay, so, I don't exactly know who the people were who got this accomplished in Washington, but I'm so grateful to them. And if I meet them, or if they're at this conference, I'd really like to hug them or shake their hands, because a couple people who were caring and smart figured out how to get a couple key reforms in some legislation that passed over the last few years. So in the infrastructure bill, a couple exciting things happened. We didn't get everything we wanted. If it was up to me, there would have been a federal highway program for sidewalks. We didn't get that, right? No one even talks about that, but I just want to put that idea in your mind for our next infrastructure bill. But, oops, sorry. So there's these new road safety funds that came out. That's a big win. I'm going to talk about that a little more later. Some vehicle safety regulations. So a lot, when I've been traveling around talking about this, one of the more depressing parts of my conversations is about this vehicle bloat we've seen, particularly with SUVs and pickup trucks. And now many of the best-selling vehicles in the United States have a 55-inch high front end. So we're talking about coming up to about my chin. So in my book, I talk about that being a big factor. And that really hasn't changed yet, but we have raised a lot of awareness about that, and in the infrastructure bill there are some exciting sort of developments in that area. I wanted to talk about. And then we're starting to see some success at the local level. Like I said, I've been traveling around talking about this for a while, and we used to be kind of like, I think people thought we were kind of crazy, because I come from an advocacy background. You know, we would be talking about Sweden, and people just thought it was really out there when we talked about Vision Zero. But now we do have sort of some evidence on the ground in the United States that those efforts are starting to pay off. Okay, so I'm going to use this as an example. I'm going to talk about this woman who, again, she's one of the heroes sort of in the field. Her name is Latanya Bird. And I talk about her story in my book, and I got a chance to meet her in Philadelphia. She's a victim. Well, her family was victims of a really notorious crash in Philadelphia. It happened in 2013, and her niece and her whole family, her niece was a single mom, and she had 4 young boys. And they were walking to a party on a summer night, and in the end, when they're walking home, they had to cross the most dangerous road in Philadelphia, which is called Roosevelt Boulevard. And while they were attempting to cross, there was 2 drivers coming up the road. They were engaged in street racing, and they struck the family at a really high speed. I think it was about 70 miles per hour. So her Samara Banks was her niece, the mother. She was killed, and 3 of the 4 boys were killed. So the whole family pretty much wiped out in this crash. And people were really outraged about it in Philadelphia. It was one of the rare cases where a pedestrian death really broke through in the media. Often the media coverage is very rote, and they just say someone was killed and they weren't in a crosswalk and traffic was affected, and that's it. But this case was pretty high profile. And I'm in a later panel where we're going to be talking about media framing in more detail on these kind of incidents. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about more. So this case, obviously very tragic, but there has been some progress just in the last few years. And it's a lot, it's a lot due, sorry for you taking the photos, it's a lot due to the work of Latanya Bird. She deserves a lot of credit. Okay, so Roosevelt Boulevard, I just want to highlight here. It's a really, really crazy road. But I think we have roads like this in almost all of our cities. You know, we have 1 or 2 roads that account for like a really disproportionate share of traffic deaths in general, or maybe pedestrian deaths. And so Roosevelt Boulevard in Philadelphia is like this. It's 12 lanes wide. And one thing about this road, which I think is common with these kind of roads, is, originally it was kind of like through a rural area. And so, maybe it didn't have sidewalks. And it's 12 lanes wide. And so it has these 2 access roads on the side. And it's longer than a football field to cross. And it goes right through a lot of densely populated neighborhoods in Philadelphia. So you can see, like in this photo that I just pulled from Google Maps, that someone's trying to cross it. Okay, so 14% of all traffic deaths that happen in Philadelphia happen on this one road. So they're having about 15 fatalities a year on Roosevelt Boulevard. So again, this is a more notorious example, but usually in every city, this is a very overwhelming problem, right? We think about how many of our roads have been built to such sort of extreme proportions that they're really intimidating for pedestrians. But really, this is where we need to start on some of these roads that have been identified already as the most dangerous, and we can have a big impact just if we can fix these. Okay, so back to the sort of good news portion. So in the meantime, this grant program, this brand new grant program came out as a result of the infrastructure bill, Safe Streets and Roads for All. And it's definitely people who are sort of I'm allied with in my advocacy work. There's great people now in USDOT sort of fighting to get more safety money into these communities. So now there's this new grant program available, and it's called Safe Streets and Roads for All. It's a competitive grant, so if you're in a state that maybe is a little bit hostile, like I am, to safety reforms or urban developments, you can bypass that, which is a nice aspect of it. Another thing I wanted to say about this is, so in the past, I come from a media and advocacy background, And I've been reporting about Vision Zero and those efforts for more than a decade. And for a while, it really wasn't very clear that Vision Zero was having much of an impact. I was looking at the data every year when I worked at Streets Blog, trying to tell, developing these graphs and trying to tell, okay, this city declared Vision Zero in 2012. Do we notice any different? Does it look different compared to other cities that didn't? And at the time, it really wasn't that clear. And I think part of the problem there was that there really wasn't the kind of buy-in we needed from the states and from the federal government. A lot of cities, like I come from Cleveland, we have a hard time just coming up with the money to keep our roads in drivable condition. So we don't have a ton of resources to pour into anything we consider extra. But now we do have this serious federal money on the table to advance these Vision Zero programs, and that's really exciting. Okay, so Roosevelt Boulevard, pulling it back, was the recipient of a grant, and that's going to be a difficult. They understand that's going to be a long. This is such this is a pun, but it's going to be a long road to fix Roosevelt Boulevard. But they've been making little improvements. They got speed cameras approved a few years ago, with Latanya Bird's advocacy being a key component. And they were awarded money from Safe Streets and Roads for All. And this is a rendering of what they hope it'll look like. So you can see some of the countermeasures that the other presenters mentioned, like pedestrian refuge islands are included. And there's a plan to do bus rapid transit along the road as well. Okay, I want to just mention really briefly, this is something I get really excited about because in my book I spend a lot of time talking about cars, and I think that the auto industry has sort of not always nurtured the kind of safety culture that we're talking about in some of our other sessions with the design, especially the front ends of certain vehicles. But we do have these wins in the newest infrastructure bill that could really help us. It's so difficult for cities to sort of do this on their own. But we need the auto industry, we need NHTSA to sort of come along and help from the vehicle safety end. And there were really some breakthroughs in the latest infrastructure bill. In the past in the United States, we've never regulated vehicles for pedestrian or cyclist safety. All the regulations were about protecting the people inside the vehicles. So for the first time, there is an inclusion of some pedestrian safety stuff. They're going to require this automatic emergency braking, which an automatic pedestrian detection, I think also automatic bicyclist protection. Someone correct me if I'm wrong about that, but that has been under discussion as well. So there really is a lot of potential in those vehicle technologies. In my book, I cite a study that's from IHS, who I think is here in the room, and they found that Subaru vehicles that had a big package of these, most of them are sensor-based tech, were 35% or around 30% less likely to be involved in a pedestrian claim, insurance claim. So that's pretty huge. And this technology is still in its infancy. The federal government hasn't been kind of imposing any standard on them because it wasn't required. So we can expect that, I think, to get better. And that's really promising and should be helpful for the localities that are working on this. Again, I sort of already covered this, but a little bit about, in case anyone's not clear on how these technologies work, they impose an automatic braking when you're about to hit someone. Okay, finally, I'm wrapping up and we're going to turn it over to a Q&A, but I just want to end with this, talking a little bit about, again, I mentioned, we're just starting to see in the last few years, it becomes sort of apparent that some cities who have made significant investments in Vision Zero are starting to see real declines, real measurable declines. One of them is New York City. Another one that I've heard of mentioned is Madison, Wisconsin. I understand it, even in the context of a real sharp increase in the rest of the country. I've seen a 35% decrease. Fremont, California is a more suburban place that also is a good example. Hoboken, I'm gonna mention Hoboken here. They have actually achieved Vision Zero, a small city, very densely populated outside of New York City. And these are the kind of tools they use. This is called intersection daylighting. seen right here, and this is a very inexpensive sort of reform they did. But what it does is it prevents cars from parking too close to the intersection and then creating a big visibility barrier there. Because they're so densely populated, that's the kind of thing that's really good for their context. So depending on your community, all these countermeasures have to be context specific. But this has been really effective for them, and they've really institutionalized it throughout all of their programs. So now whenever they do a street repaving, instead of it being made from bollards and paint very cheaply, they go out and they make it concrete. And they're really thinking through safety at every level, very comprehensive. So it's not just Hoboken. Hoboken is actually a kind of a small city, but Jersey City, its neighbor recently, which has a population, I can't remember, it's about 300 or 400,000, achieved 0 traffic deaths last year, excepting state-owned roads, where there was about 5. So that's pretty huge. It's about the size of Cincinnati, and in Cincinnati, I think they had around 30 deaths, just for comparison. Okay, so with that, we have a little bit of time for a Q&A, and I'm going to turn it back over to our moderator.
Thank you, Angie. I would ask if you have a question, please start to make your way to the podium and that you introduce yourself prior to asking your question. While you're making your way to the podium, I do want to make a small shameless plug. In October 2020, NHTSA launched our first ever National Pedestrian Safety Month to put a spotlight on people getting injured or killed while walking. We've continued to build momentum each year and expanded the focus of Pedestrian Safety Month in 2023 to incorporate the tenets of a safe system approach. Designing the weeks around focus areas of safer people, safer speeds, safer roads, safer vehicles, and post-crash care. I would encourage you to visit trafficsafetymarketing.gov for free resources and materials on the various behavioral traffic safety program areas, and keep an eye out for the Pedestrian Safety Month materials for 2024, which we're hoping will be launched here in the coming months. I know we have some questions out there. If you could just make your way to the podium so those that are joining us virtually can hear you.
All right. Good morning, or it's still morning, right? Yeah. Hi, Emily Kleinfelter with Denver Regional Council of Governments. This is for Karen. I was just wondering, for the vulnerable roadway user assessment, we just finished ours here in Colorado. I'm not sure if this was just to Colorado or not, but when we were looking at the crash severity, we were only looking at serious injury and fatal crashes involving vulnerable road users. And then also, it was not including e-bikes as vulnerable road users. I was wondering what FHWA is doing to think about the expansion of not just serious injury, but also minor injury, because we know vulnerable road users, any type of injury can be life-altering, quite frankly, or scare them off the roadway. And then also, e-bikes are a huge new type of transportation, and if we're including those as a vulnerable road user mode as well.
Yeah, so unfortunately, can you guys hear me? Oh, there. Okay, so unfortunately, both of those things are requirements. Those are in the legislation, so states are required to look at fatalities and serious injuries. That doesn't mean that they can't look beyond that to those other less severe crashes in their analysis, but they have to look at fatalities and serious injuries. So they could have looked at all crashes and then did a disaggregated analysis of just fatalities and serious injuries. And similarly, for e-bikes, our definition of vulnerable road user is based on FARS categories, so pedestrians, bicyclists, other cyclists, and persons on personal conveyances. And so that definition currently does not include e-bikes. But again, the guidance we provided to states was that if they wanted to include some of those other vulnerable road users, they could do that, and to look at them in a disaggregate way, because the strategies for each of those vulnerable road users is going to be different. So to change that, we need a change in legislation, is the short answer.
Other questions from the audience? If not, I'm going to pick on Jonathan, and I'm going to ask Jonathan a question. Jonathan, what changed in the first half of 2023 that led to fewer pedestrian deaths after several years of increases?
I wish you happy birthday, and then you pick on me. I don't know, Michelle. That's the magic question, right? And we don't know the answer to that. We need to see more research. We need to see more evaluation. It's 6 months of data. We want to, as I said, I want to come back here next year and see, now have a year and a half of data. We think that we're starting to see some of these successes that Angie mentioned. It's starting to become too many to fit on a slide now. It's not just Hoboken. It's not just New York City. And USDOT has a great website where you can go in and look and plug in zero, and you can look at all the different communities, and it's not the usual suspects. We're seeing places like in South Dakota that have had zero fatalities over a year, and that number is growing a little bit every year. And so there's a lot happening, obviously, with infrastructure. This money's starting to get into cities and get into communities. I do think we are starting to see a bit of a turnaround with enforcement. That that pushback that we all had on enforcement, starting to shift a little bit the other direction. I live in Washington, D.C. We reduced our funding to the police in 20 and 21 significantly, and traffic enforcement went down. What's happened in Washington, D.C.? Traffic deaths have skyrocketed since that, and we started to see our legislature, our DC City Council is putting more money into equitable enforcement. They're actually increasing the number of officers. So there's starting to be some examples of that around the country. Doesn't mean we want to go back to the way things were in enforcement, but we know that fair and equitable enforcement with the community's involvement is making a difference, and we think that's starting to pay off.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I'll just mention, Jonathan did mention the grant funds. If you're not familiar with SS4A, please take a look at the United States Department of Transportation's website. There are grant funds available, and I do know that we have an upcoming application deadline in May. So moving right along, I'm just going to go down the line, and Karen, I have a question for you. For our state partners in the room and those that are joining us virtually online, where would I find my state's vulnerable road user assessment?
So all the states posted their vulnerable road user safety assessments on their SHSP website. So where they have their strategic highway safety plan, you can find their vulnerable road user safety assessment. Or you can go to our website, the FHWA Office of Safety website, and they are all linked from our website as well. So the links, I provided that link in my presentation, which you should have access to through the app.
Could I just add one thing to that? Looking around the room and online, there are a lot of folks that are in the highway safety office, the behavioral highway safety office. You may say, well, that's interesting what they're doing. It's more than interesting. Thinking again about the safe system approach, you should dig into this data. If you're not working closely, if you're in the behavioral program and you're not working closely with the HSIP side of the house, you all need to get together and talk about what you can do together, look at your data together, and this is really valuable.
Thank you. Yes, please.
And Karen, one follow-up question for you. How often do I, as a state, have to do the vulnerable road user assessment?
So it's now part of the state's strategic highway safety plan, and they are required to update their SHSPs at least once every 5 years. And every state is on a different cycle, so some states are currently in the process of updating their SHSP and will be updating their vulnerable road user safety assessment, whereas others just completed their update and won't be updating it for another couple of years.
Thanks, Karen. Go ahead.
Lacey Tisler from the Nevada Department of Transportation, and I think this is more for Karen than anyone. But with Safe Streets and Roads for All being eligible for all locals at all levels, and having the states be expected to be the expert for many, many years, do you have any advice for us at the state level to help our local partners really be able to get those funds?
Thank you, Lacey, for that question. We would absolutely love the state departments of transportation to partner with the local agencies. You all have a wealth of expertise that would greatly benefit them. So, I mean, one idea is I would encourage just to corral them all together. I think that really the idea of peer exchange and sharing the expertise that you have with all the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant recipients in Nevada or whatever state you work in, I think just sharing that expertise and knowledge with them would be a great value for them. So we would absolutely encourage you to work with them. I know some state DOTs are providing the match for some of the grants. If the projects don't get funded, there's a limited amount of funding in SS4A, and so if they're not getting funded for an implementation project, perhaps reaching out to them and sharing other funding opportunities that are available through the DOT. I think there are lots of opportunities to coordinate and collaborate with local agencies, and I think that's necessary if we're going to get to zero.
And I would,
If you're in a highway safety office, the same answer applies to you. I don't know if there's anyone in California in the room or not, but the California Highway Safety Office, they got the list of all the cities that receive money in SS4A. And now the Highway Safety Office has reached out to them and sent them a letter to say, hey, we're here to support you. We're here to provide any resources that we can. Highway safety offices, DOTs, you all know how to get federal money. So if these local cities are trying to figure out how to do this, you have the experience of going through the somewhat arduous process at times of qualifying for federal money. So reach out. And remember, the SS4A isn't just infrastructure. You can use that to support EMS.
Good point.
You can use that to support data. You can use that to support enforcement and community engagement. So again, if you're in a highway safety office, your ears should be open.
and that's a really good point, to make sure that you look beyond, it's not just infrastructure. The other thing I wanted to add to that is we do have, United States Department of Transportation does regular routine webinars on training for applying for SS4A grants. So I would encourage you to take a look at the website for SS4A because we do have recordings available to share with your state and local partners.
Hi, everyone. Allie Geller from Families for Safe Streets. I'm wondering about any advice for how we can be pressing on the auto industry, because that's clearly such a huge, no pun intended, part of the challenges that we're facing.
We all look at Angie.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I think we're not very well organized on that. Like, I spent a lot of time in my presentations talking about cars, and then people are kind of like, it's a lot, the audience is often similar to this, and they're kind of like, what does this even have to do with us? But I do think we could do a better job sort of being at the table and staying abreast of what the important regulations are that are coming before Congress. Like, there'll be truck underride guards. There was recently some really good reporting about that, and some of these issues, not that specifically, but hundreds or thousands of lives could be at stake, and it's discussed in Washington, and the press doesn't really cover it except for like the trucking news. No one's paying attention. So we do need to sort of better connect dots there. I think there's a lot of work to be done. The groups that are doing that work are underfunded, on Capitol Hill are underfunded, and they need more support. And we haven't, part of the reason we've seen this is some of them, like I think Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety, who's always there, they go back to the Ralph Nader era. So there was a real consciousness raising during that era that we've all benefited from, and NHTSA came out of that, and all of our vehicle safety regulations. And there's a need to sort of rebuild some of that public interest and infrastructure to support that, I guess.
Thanks, Angie. Other questions? Go ahead. No problem.
I'm Boulder County Transportation Planning Division, and I have a question about the focus of safety funding for urban compared to rural. We have a case of a U.S. highway where people are dying. It's rural, high-speed, undivided, and through an application of Safe Streets and Roads for All, and an analysis because we were unsuccessful in our grant application, we learned that there is a focus on systems and multimodal within cities. However, people are dying in rural environments, and we are at a loss to find funding of vehicle-to-vehicle or vehicle run off the road or head-on crashes. Anyway, if I've described this scenario correctly, what are your thoughts about urban versus rural funding, and what Boulder County and other jurisdictions can do for safety funding of rural areas?
Everybody's looking at me. I guess that's for me. So that's a great question, and I know USDOT has a routes initiative that is really focused on improving safety on rural roads. And I believe, I'm not an expert on routes or that initiative, but I do believe that they have some resources available that gets to exactly what you're talking about, what those funding opportunities are for rural roads. I would encourage you to work with Colorado Department of Transportation. They have access to HSIP funding that could be used on those rural roads. So there are opportunities, and if you connect with me offline, I can certainly send you that routes information and maybe point you in the right direction with the Colorado DOT.
And I would just add to that, NHTSA also has efforts in the rural areas on the behavioral traffic safety side, specifically for pupil transportation, and we're working on some for pedestrian safety as well. I would encourage you to apply again. There is another application a deadline in May, and I would encourage you to continue to apply because it is important. Thank you for bringing that to our attention.
This is where your highway safety office again, your DOT, your highway safety office can help. They can put a note out on the GHSA listserv for someone in your situation so that we can see an application that has been approved. You probably can find that directly from the DOT website or from DOT as well. But you're not alone, and so let's look at another area, another community that has a similar challenge and something that was approved.
Other questions?
Can I chime in and add something? So I want to say that, we're talking about this recent decrease that we've seen in traffic deaths, and it is good news that they didn't rise again. But I do think it's actually kind of concerning that we see traffic deaths leveling off, kind of at this heightened level that we saw during the pandemic. And if we're not able to reduce it at least to where we were in the pre-pandemic level, we're talking about as many as 10,000 additional deaths overall a year. So that's just something I wanted to add.
Thank you, Angie. And we'll actually go right down the row. Dr. Shaon, closing words, 30 seconds.
Yeah, so from our perspective, so as I presented our case study for Connecticut, so from a researcher's perspective, data analytics is important. So you can use statistically sound methodology or other methodology that can identify your sites so you can use your funding more appropriately. So to use your funding more appropriately, you need to identify where the hotspots are, what community are at high risk, using different factors or risk factors, socioeconomic and demographic factors. I think utilizing all these is important, as also Karen mentioned, some of the states also used toxicology data, citation data. So for example, for Connecticut, we didn't have access to citation and toxicology data. We had data before COVID. After COVID, the data stopped. So we are still negotiating with the agencies to get access to those data. Once we have those data, we'll also include those in our analysis. So the main point is use a methodology that can incorporate as many risk factors as possible so that you can identify high-risk communities, underserved communities, or locations where these crashes are more predominant.
Thank you. Karen?
So I'll just reiterate my call to action to all of you. I think that we all have a role to improve vulnerable road user safety, and I think the vulnerable road user safety assessments are a great place to start, and an opportunity to identify new partners that you can collaborate with to reduce fatalities and serious injuries. I absolutely love that I was sitting here next to Jonathan, and for every answer I gave, he gave you the State Highway Safety Office side. So I think there are opportunities to work together and explore funding opportunities, explore opportunities to get in the community and do some of that outreach. And so again, I'll just repeat what the Colonel said yesterday, is that we can't do this alone. We need to work together and we need to support each other, and I think that includes all of us here in this room. Thank you.
I'll end on optimism, since I was a little negative early. Thinking about partners, why did alcohol change? Why did the numbers change with alcohol? It's because of MAD, because people stood up. Survivor advocates said, I never want this to happen to anyone else. And that's how we're going to make a difference in this issue. We have to have people speaking up. So we have to support organizations. We have to support survivor advocates. I'm a huge fan of Families for Safe Streets, and I was glad that we had a question from them today, and other organizations like that. I'm not going to mention other names because I'll forget people, but we've got to think about that. That's the piece that's missing. We talk about changes that we need to have made on Capitol Hill the next time. The next reauthorization is going to be tough. We know the political climate we're living in. There's a chance that some of these great things actually go the other direction. And so we will actually want to keep moving towards safety. So let's support these survivor advocates that are loud and that are making a difference.
Thanks, Jonathan. Day in, day out, we are faced with the tragedies on our nation's roadways that hit far too close to home. As Jonathan mentioned earlier, it's someone's neighbor, it's someone's coworker, it's someone's family member. We all know as transportation professionals that our work doesn't end at the end of our day. We know this is a preventable crisis that will require all of us working together to implement a holistic, safe system approach. Multiple layers of protection must be in place to lessen the risk for all road users, but particularly for those who choose, people who walk, people who bike, and people who roll. The safe system approach offers a comprehensive set of strategies to address all contributing factors to that crashes that injure and kill people on foot. We must all work together to ensure that all road users have a right to safe mobility regardless of the form of transportation they decide to take. Thank you to our experts today for sharing the life-saving work that they are doing out in the field to contribute, and thank you to our first responders community, law enforcement, fire and EMS, and our partners here in the room, and thank you to all of those who joined us virtually online and for all the great work that you are doing. We couldn't do what we do without each and every one of you. Thank you again to all those that joined us virtually. The only acceptable number we all know is 0, and a safe system approach is the way to get there. It'll take all of our efforts and more to bring about substantial and lasting change. I would ask that you please remember to fill out your conference evaluation for all of the sessions. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and hopefully all of you are joining us at the luncheon. Thank you so much.